The morning sun blazed mercilessly across the Arizona Badlands as Sarah Chen crouched beside the limestone outcrop, her trowel scraping against centuries of sediment. Sweat darkened the back of her field shirt despite the early hour, and her thick glasses kept sliding down her nose, a constant reminder of the vision problems that made her an oddity among the field researchers. Dr. Marcus Thornfield had made it clear from day one that her myopia was a liability, that she was here on sufferance, a diversity hire from the university who needed to prove herself twice as hard as the men. "Chen!" Thornfield's voice cracked like a whip across the dig site. "Stop dawdling with that brushwork. We need real progress today, not art class." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept working methodically. The other graduate students, all men, had learned to ignore Thornfield's constant needling of her, but she felt their sideways glances nonetheless. Her careful technique had actually uncovered more intact specimens than anyone else this season, though Thornfield never acknowledged it publicly. The bone emerged slowly from the matrix, its surface gleaming white under her gentle brushwork. Something felt wrong immediately. The preservation was too perfect, the coloration too fresh. Sarah's pulse quickened as she recognized the distinctive curve of a femur. But this was no ancient fossil. Her trained eye, strengthened by years of compensating for her poor distance vision, caught details that others might miss up close. "Dr. Thornfield," she called, her voice carefully neutral. "Could you examine this specimen?" Thornfield approached with his characteristic heavy stride, field boots crunching on the rocky ground. His weathered face, permanently squinted from decades under desert suns, showed irritation at being summoned by the apprentice. Behind him, the other students gathered, Jim Cartwright with his perpetual sneer, David Ross trying to look important, and quiet Miguel Santos, who rarely spoke but observed everything. Thornfield knelt beside the excavation, his experienced hands immediately recognizing what Sarah had found. His face went pale beneath his tan. The bone was human, recent, and had no business being in a Cretaceous formation. "Pack it up," he said quietly. "Standard cataloging. Formation 12, Layer 7. "But sir," Sarah began, "the dating—" "I said pack it up, Chen." His voice carried a warning edge that made the other students shift uncomfortably. "And I want complete documentation sealed. No discussion of this specimen outside this team." Sarah felt the familiar knot in her stomach that came with being silenced. The rule was absolute in paleontology. Proper documentation, proper channels, proper hierarchy. Graduate students, especially female ones with vision problems who barely belonged in the field, did not question senior researchers. The bone disappeared into Thornfield's private collection bag, tagged with coordinates that would bury it in bureaucratic layers. That afternoon, as the team returned to Copper Ridge, the small mining town that served as their base, Sarah noticed the man in the diner watching her. He wore a sheriff's uniform but sat in civilian clothes, nursing coffee that had long gone cold. When their eyes met briefly, he nodded. Not friendly, but acknowledging. Something in his expression suggested he knew exactly what they had found in the desert. The motel room felt stifling despite the rattling air conditioner. Sarah lay on the thin mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling and thinking about proper channels. The university ethics code was clear. All significant finds required immediate reporting through official channels. But Thornfield's order had been equally clear, backed by the implicit threat to her funding, her degree, her future in a field that barely tolerated women. She reached for her field notebook, the leather cover worn smooth by constant handling. Her myopia actually helped with close detail work, allowing her to sketch anatomical features with precision that impressed even Thornfield when he thought no one was looking. The bone measurements filled 3 pages, dimensions that would prove its recent origin to any qualified examiner. A soft knock interrupted her documentation. Sarah opened the door to find Miguel Santos holding 2 cups of coffee from the diner. "Thought you might want this," he said in accented English. His dark eyes held understanding without judgment. Long day in the field. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully. Miguel had worked construction before returning to school, and his weathered hands showed the calluses of real labor. Unlike the other graduate students, he treated her as an equal rather than an obstacle to his own advancement. "The specimen today," Miguel said carefully, settling into the room's single chair. "It troubles you." "All specimens require proper documentation," Sarah replied, testing whether he could be trusted with her doubts. Miguel nodded slowly. "My grandfather worked mines in Sonora. Sometimes miners find things that are not mineral, things that make officials nervous." He paused, studying her face. "Officials prefer such things to disappear quietly." Sarah felt a chill despite the desert heat. What happened to those miners? The smart ones learned to see only what they were supposed to see. Miguel set down his cup. "But sometimes smart is not enough. Sometimes there are witnesses who remember what should be forgotten." The implication hung between them like smoke. Someone in Copper Ridge knew about recent burials in the desert, knew that a paleontology team might uncover inconvenient evidence. The sheriff's acknowledgement at the diner suddenly made more sense. Not curiosity about their research, but monitoring of their discoveries. Sarah opened her notebook again, this time to a different section where she kept personal observations separate from official field notes. Miguel watched without comment as she wrote a detailed account of the day's find, including her concerns about the dating discrepancy. If proper channels were compromised, she needed her own record. "There is something else," Miguel said quietly. "Jim Cartwright has been asking questions in town. About you specifically. About your background, your family connections." Sarah's pen paused over the paper. Cartwright's hostility had seemed like typical graduate school competition, but targeted inquiry suggested something more calculated. "What kind of questions?" "Whether you have family in law enforcement, whether you might have connections to federal agencies." Miguel's expression grew troubled. "The locals are not friendly to such questions, but they remember who asks them." The pieces began forming a disturbing pattern. The bone in the Cretaceous formation was not random. Someone had used the paleontology dig as cover for disposal, counting on academic discretion to avoid official scrutiny. Thornfield's immediate suppression suggested either complicity or coercion, and now her own background was under investigation by someone who should have been her colleague. Sarah closed the notebook and secured it in her field bag. The proper channel would be to report her concerns to the university administration, but that route required evidence she was forbidden to document officially. The alternative was to trust her observations and act independently, a violation of every protocol that governed her precarious position in the program. Miguel stood to leave, then paused at the door. "My grandmother had a saying, 'Sometimes the eyes that see poorly in the distance see most clearly what is close at hand.'" He smiled slightly. "Sleep well, Sarah Chen. Tomorrow brings new discoveries." Alone again, Sarah sat by the window, watching the lights of Copper Ridge flicker in the desert night. Her thick glasses reflected the neon motel sign, distorting her view of the distance but sharpening her focus on immediate concerns. The bone existed, documented in her private notes with measurements that proved its recent origin. The questions about her background suggested someone feared she might pursue official channels despite Thornfield's prohibition. She made her decision with the calculated risk-taking that had brought her this far, despite systemic obstacles. Tomorrow she would begin her own investigation, using the systematic methodology that made her an effective researcher. The proper channels could wait until she understood what she was reporting and to whom she could safely report it. The desert wind rattled her window as Sarah prepared for sleep, field clothes laid out for another day of officially finding nothing while privately documenting everything. Her myopia might make her an imperfect field researcher by conventional standards, but it had trained her to examine closely what others might overlook. Tomorrow, she would put that training to use. In the distance, a pair of headlights moved slowly along the road between the dig site and town. Too late for casual traffic, too purposeful for random travel. Sarah adjusted her glasses and watched until the lights disappeared, then made a final entry in her notebook. Day 1. Surveillance confirmed. The morning briefing took place under the canvas shelter that served as the dig's field headquarters, with Thornfield standing like a general before his troops. Sarah noticed how he positioned himself with the rising sun at his back, forcing the graduate students to squint as they listened. The tactical advantage was subtle but deliberate, another reminder of who controlled their circumstances. Today we focus on the established grid sections, Thornfield announced, consulting his clipboard with theatrical precision. Chen, you'll work Sector 9, the limestone exposure near the access road. His eyes found hers with calculating coldness. Close supervision required for quality control. Sarah felt the familiar burn of public humiliation. Sector 9 was the least promising area of the dig, traditionally assigned to undergraduate volunteers as busy work. The other students smirked at her demotion, except for Miguel, who kept his expression carefully neutral. Jim Cartwright's satisfaction was particularly obvious. He had been promoted to team leader for the day's primary excavation. "Sir," Sarah said carefully, "yesterday's specimen from Sector 12 requires follow-up documentation." "Yesterday's specimen has been properly processed and catalogued," Thornfield cut her off. "Your concern should be with today's assignments, not questioning completed work." The rebuke carried across the dig site, ensuring everyone heard her correction. The unspoken rule crystallized in that moment. Questioning official decisions was insubordination, regardless of scientific merit. Sarah's myopia might make her exceptional at close-detail work, but it also marked her as different, vulnerable to exclusion from the essential networks that determined academic survival. Thornfield's message was clear: conform or be eliminated from the program. David Ross would serve as her supervisor for the day, a humiliation compounded by his junior status and obvious discomfort with the assignment. As they walked toward Sector 9, Sarah noticed the same sheriff's vehicle parked at the overlook above the dig site, close enough to observe activities, but distant enough to maintain plausible deniability. "This is really awkward," David muttered as they reached the designated area. "I mean, your technique is actually better than most of us, but Thornfield says you need monitoring for protocol compliance." Sarah began setting up her tools with methodical precision. "Protocol compliance means following proper documentation procedures?" "Well, yeah, and not making unauthorized interpretations of specimens." David shifted uncomfortably. "Look, just do the work and don't ask complicated questions. We all want to finish the program without trouble." The limestone exposure in Sector 9 proved more interesting than expected. Sarah's careful brushwork revealed a series of small artifacts embedded in the matrix. Not fossils, but manufactured objects that clearly post-dated the formation. Metal fragments, cloth fibers, and what appeared to be synthetic materials created a pattern of recent contamination that contradicted the geological dating. Each discovery presented the same dilemma as yesterday's bone. Proper documentation required reporting finds that someone clearly wanted to remain buried. Yet failing to document violated the scientific standards that justified her presence in the program. Sarah chose a middle path, photographing and measuring each artifact while maintaining neutral descriptions in her official notes. "What are you finding over there?" David called from his position 20 feet away, where he was supposed to be working while supervising her. "Anomalous inclusions in the matrix," Sarah replied truthfully. "Possible contamination from surface activity." The phrasing was deliberately vague, technically accurate but avoiding inflammatory interpretations. By midday, the heat had become oppressive. Sarah worked with her shirt sleeves rolled up, her forearms showing the scratches and calluses that marked genuine field work. Her thick glasses fogged regularly in the humidity, requiring constant cleaning that slowed her progress but allowed time for careful observation. The pattern of artifacts suggested systematic burial rather than random contamination. Someone had used this area as a disposal site multiple times, counting on the remote location and academic oversight to prevent discovery. The paleontology dig provided perfect cover. Any finds would be handled through university channels that could be influenced or suppressed. "Chen!" Thornfield's voice carried across the dig site with sharp authority. "Report to headquarters immediately." Sarah felt her stomach drop. The summons sounded official, formal in a way that suggested serious consequences. She gathered her tools and notes, acutely aware of David's nervous expression as he watched her respond to the call. Thornfield waited beside a folding table where her morning's documentation lay spread for inspection. The sheriff from the diner stood nearby, close enough to observe but not officially participating in the academic review. Sarah recognized the careful choreography of plausible deniability. "These field notes show concerning irregularities," Thornfield began, his voice pitched to carry across the dig site. "Unauthorized photography of non-specimen materials, detailed measurements of surface contamination, speculation about site usage outside the research parameters." Sarah felt the trap closing around her. "Sir, standard protocol requires documentation of all finds within the excavation area." "Standard protocol," Thornfield interrupted, "requires following supervisor guidance about what constitutes relevant findings. Your role is data collection, not interpretation." He lifted one of her photographs, a clear image of metal fragments in the limestone matrix. "This represents a waste of research resources and a violation of focused methodology." The public nature of the confrontation was calculated to humiliate and isolate her. The other graduate students watched from their work positions, witnessing her professional destruction as a warning about the consequences of non-compliance. Sarah's myopia forced her to stand closer than comfortable to read Thornfield's expression, making her appear defensive and aggressive. "Dr. Thornfield," she said, keeping her voice level, "the university ethics guidelines require complete documentation of excavation activities. I was following established protocols for field research." The sheriff stepped forward slightly, not speaking, but making his presence felt in the academic discussion. Thornfield nodded acknowledgement of the subtle support. "Miss Chen," Thornfield said, using her title rather than her academic rank, "your interpretation of ethics guidelines appears to conflict with project leadership decisions. This suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of research hierarchy and collaborative methodology." Sarah recognized the language of academic elimination, formal phrases that would justify removing her from the program while maintaining institutional cover. Her vision problems, her gender, her tendency to question authority could all be framed as professional inadequacies that warranted dismissal. But Miguel's advice from the previous evening suggested a different approach. Instead of direct confrontation, she needed to find procedural protection for her position. "Sir, I request formal clarification of documentation standards," Sarah said carefully. "If current protocols need modification, I should receive written guidance to ensure compliance." The request was reasonable and difficult to refuse without appearing arbitrary. Thornfield's expression showed irritation at her tactical maneuvering. "Written protocols exist in the project guidelines you received at orientation. Review them thoroughly before tomorrow's work assignment." The sheriff moved closer to the table, his attention focused on Sarah's photographs. "Interesting rock formations out there," he commented casually. "Lots of natural variation in the landscape." His tone was conversational, but Sarah caught the underlying message. The artifacts she had documented were being reframed as natural geological features, not evidence of human activity. The official position would be that her myopia had caused misinterpretation of normal surface conditions. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, to both men simultaneously. I'll review the guidelines carefully to ensure proper identification of geological versus archaeological materials. The double meaning was subtle but clear. She understood the game being played while maintaining her own documentation standards. Thornfield dismissed her with obvious displeasure, but the sheriff nodded approvingly at her diplomatic response. As Sarah walked back toward Sector 9, she noticed Jim Cartwright intercepting her path. His expression held the satisfaction of someone whose position had been strengthened by another's misfortune. "Heard you had some trouble with your field notes," he said with false sympathy. "Must be frustrating when your eyesight causes professional problems." Sarah stopped walking, forcing him to face her directly rather than delivering his comments in passing. "My documentation has been consistently accurate throughout the program." "Sure, but accuracy isn't the only consideration." Jim's smile was predatory. "Team compatibility matters too, especially for someone who depends on program funding to continue their studies." The threat was explicit. Her financial aid could disappear if she continued to cause problems for project leadership. Sarah's family background provided no safety net. Losing the assistantship would end her academic career immediately. "I understand the importance of team collaboration," Sarah replied carefully, "and the value of thorough documentation that protects everyone's interests." Jim's expression shifted as he processed the implication. Her documentation could protect the team, but it could also expose activities that others preferred to keep buried. The photographs and measurements existed regardless of official suppression, creating potential leverage for future negotiations. "Well," Jim said, his confidence slightly shaken, "just remember that some discoveries are better left undiscovered. For everyone's sake." Sarah returned to Sector 9 with new understanding of her position. The artifacts she had found were significant enough to warrant intimidation and suppression, which suggested criminal rather than merely academic implications. Her documentation represented both evidence and insurance, dangerous to possess, but potentially essential for survival. David had abandoned any pretense of supervision, working on his own excavation 30 feet away. Sarah continued her systematic documentation, but now she understood why her thick glasses and careful attention to detail made her dangerous to certain interests. Her myopia was not a disability in this context. It was a professional advantage that others feared. As the afternoon sun angled toward the western mountains, Sarah made her final entries in both official and personal field notes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and escalating pressure, but tonight she would transfer her documentation to secure locations that could survive confiscation or intimidation. The sheriff's vehicle remained at the overlook as the team prepared to leave the dig site. Sarah adjusted her glasses and looked directly up at the distant figure, acknowledging the mutual surveillance with professional calm. She had been warned about the consequences of asking questions, but she had also learned the value of the answers she was finding. The phone call came at 3 in the morning, jarring Sarah from restless sleep in her stifling motel room. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "Miss Chen, this is Sheriff Wade Morrison. I need you to come to the station for a brief conversation about your research activities." Sarah fumbled for her glasses in the darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Sir, it's the middle of the night. Can this wait until dash dash?" "No, ma'am, it cannot wait. I'll expect you within the hour." The line went dead before she could respond. The Copper Ridge Sheriff's Station occupied a converted storefront on the town's main strip, its windows glowing harsh fluorescent white against the desert darkness. Sarah parked her battered Honda beside 2 patrol cars and a black sedan that looked distinctly federal. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted her thick glasses and gathered the courage to walk inside. Sheriff Morrison was younger than she had expected, perhaps 40, with the lean build of someone who had seen military service. His uniform was crisp despite the late hour, suggesting he had dressed specifically for this meeting. The federal agent introduced himself as Special Agent Collins, from some bureaucratic subdivision that Sarah didn't quite catch. "Miss Chen, thank you for coming in so promptly," Morrison began, gesturing toward a chair across from his desk. "We need to discuss some concerns that have arisen regarding your field work." The interview room was deliberately uncomfortable. Harsh lighting that made Sarah squint despite her glasses, metal chairs that conducted the air conditioning's chill, and the constant awareness of being recorded by equipment she couldn't see, but knew was present. "Your documentation practices have attracted attention," Agent Collins continued, consulting a file that seemed surprisingly thick for 3 days of dig work. "Specifically, your tendency to photograph and catalog materials outside the stated research parameters." Sarah chose her words carefully. "I follow standard archaeological documentation protocols as taught in my graduate program." Morrison leaned forward, his expression shifting from official courtesy to something more personal. "Miss Chen, let me be direct. This county has agreements with the university regarding research activities in our jurisdiction. Those agreements include specific limitations on what gets documented and reported." The revelation hit like a physical blow. The dig wasn't just academically compromised, it was operating under official constraints that made her documentation potentially criminal. Sarah felt the trap closing around her from directions she hadn't even considered. "I wasn't aware of any special limitations," she said truthfully. "Dr. Thornfield should have briefed his team on local protocols," Collins replied, making a note in his file. "But your background check raised some additional concerns that require clarification." Sarah's blood went cold. "Background check?" Morrison opened a different folder, revealing information that made her stomach lurch. Her father's military service record, her undergraduate research on forensic archaeology, her graduate thesis proposal on using paleontological techniques for crime scene analysis. Details that painted her as exactly the wrong person to stumble across inconvenient evidence. "Your academic specialization makes you a particular concern," Morrison continued. "Someone with your training might draw conclusions that could complicate ongoing investigations." The implication was clear. They knew she had the skills to identify the artifacts as evidence of criminal activity. Her myopia, which forced her to examine everything closely, combined with forensic training to make her observations professionally credible and legally dangerous. "Sheriff Morrison," Sarah said carefully, "I'm just a graduate student trying to complete my degree requirements. I have no interest in complications." Collins smiled without warmth. "That's exactly what we hoped to hear. Because we have a proposition that could benefit everyone involved." The arrangement they outlined was elegantly simple and utterly corrupting. Sarah would continue her work on the dig, but her documentation would be filtered through official channels that could redact sensitive materials. In exchange, she would receive additional funding for her graduate studies and guaranteed placement in a prestigious postdoctoral position. "The alternative," Morrison added quietly, "is that your visa status comes under review for academic misconduct. International students have very little protection when universities withdraw their support." Sarah felt the walls closing in from every direction. Her student visa depended on maintaining good standing in the graduate program, but her program position now depended on complicity with suppression of evidence. The financial incentives were substantial enough to seem generous, but they came with obligations that would compromise her professional integrity permanently. "I need time to consider this offer," Sarah said. "Of course," Collins replied, "but understand that time is limited. We need your decision before tomorrow's fieldwork begins." The drive back to the motel passed in a blur of desert darkness and racing thoughts. Sarah's academic training had prepared her for many challenges, but not for navigating corruption that reached from local law enforcement through federal agencies into university administration. Her myopia seemed like a perfect metaphor. She could see immediate details clearly, but the larger picture remained dangerously obscure. Back in her room, Sarah spread her documentation across the narrow bed and tried to assess her real position. The photographs and measurements represented evidence of criminal activity, But possessing that evidence now appeared to be more dangerous than the original crimes. Her foreign student status made her vulnerable to deportation, while her specialized knowledge made her too dangerous to ignore. A soft knock interrupted her analysis. Miguel stood in the hallway holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of deep concern. "I saw the sheriff's car at your motel," he said quietly. "Are you in trouble?" Sarah let him inside, grateful for any friendly presence in the isolation that was closing around her. Miguel's weathered face showed genuine worry as he took in her scattered documentation and obvious distress. "They want me to cooperate with evidence suppression," Sarah said simply. "Official cooperation, with financial incentives and professional advancement." Miguel nodded grimly. "My grandfather faced similar choices in the mines. Officials who offered good money for forgetting inconvenient discoveries." He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "What did your grandfather choose?" "He took the money and stayed silent for 20 years, Miguel replied. "But he also kept his own records, hidden where officials could not find them. When the time was right, those records protected his family from retaliation." Sarah understood the suggestion. Accept the arrangement publicly while maintaining private documentation that could provide future protection or leverage. The approach required careful balance. Enough compliance to avoid immediate danger, enough independence to preserve long-term options. "There is something else you should know," Miguel continued. "Jim Cartwright has been meeting with Sheriff Morrison regularly since the dig began. Their relationship predates your arrival here." The revelation added another layer to the conspiracy. Cartwright wasn't just a competitive graduate student. He was positioned as an insider who could monitor and influence the team's activities. His hostility towards Sarah made more sense now. She represented a threat to an arrangement that benefited his own advancement. "Miguel, why are you helping me?" Sarah asked directly. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the desert night. "My grandmother used to say that truth is like water. It finds cracks in any barrier and eventually breaks through. But sometimes it needs help finding those cracks." Sarah gathered her documentation and secured it in her field bag. The decision was clearer now. She would accept the arrangement publicly while maintaining her private records and continuing her investigation through more careful channels. The approach was risky, but her alternatives had been eliminated by forces beyond her control. "Tomorrow I become officially cooperative," Sarah said. "But unofficially I keep asking questions." Miguel smiled approvingly. "Questions are not forbidden if they are asked quietly and answered carefully." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing. There are people in town who remember things that officials prefer forgotten. If you need allies, look for those who have lived here longest and spoken least." Alone again, Sarah prepared for a few hours of sleep before facing the new reality of her situation. The arrangement with Morrison and Collins would provide cover for continued research, but it would also mark her as compromised in ways that could haunt her entire career. Her myopia had made her valuable as a close observer, but it had also made her vulnerable to forces that operated beyond her range of vision. She made final entries in her private field notes, documenting the late-night meeting and the terms of cooperation that had been imposed rather than chosen. Tomorrow she would begin the delicate process of serving multiple masters while protecting her own interests and integrity. The desert wind rattled her window as Sarah finally settled into restless sleep, field clothes laid out for another day of officially finding nothing while privately documenting everything that mattered. Her thick glasses sat on the nightstand, ready to help her see clearly through whatever deceptions the new day would bring. Dawn brought an unexpected visitor to the dig site, a woman in her 70s with silver hair braided down her back and hands that showed decades of desert work. She introduced herself to the team as Elena Vasquez, a local historian documenting traditional land uses for the County Historical Society. Thornfield welcomed her with the forced politeness reserved for civilian intrusions into academic work. I've been mapping old mining claims and burial sites, Elena explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived in Copper Ridge since childhood. Your excavation is in an area with significant cultural history that should be properly recorded. Sarah noticed Elena's eyes lingering on her work area, taking in the careful documentation and photographic equipment with the assessment of someone who understood their significance. When their gazes met briefly, Elena nodded almost imperceptibly, a recognition that passed between them like a shared secret. Thornfield's discomfort was obvious. Miss Vasquez, our research focuses on geological formations from the Cretaceous period. I doubt there's any overlap with historical land usage. Oh, but there is, Elena replied mildly. This area has been used for burials going back generations, first by the Apache, then by miners who died in accidents, and more recently by— She paused delicately. Well, let's say by people who needed discreet resting places. The implicit threat was elegant and unmistakable. Elena possessed knowledge that could expose the entire arrangement between the dig team, local law enforcement, and federal authorities. Her presence transformed the dynamic of the excavation site from academic research to historical documentation that carried legal weight. Jim Cartwright moved closer to Thornfield, his expression showing the concern of someone whose careful plans were being disrupted by unexpected variables. Sarah continued working methodically while listening to the conversation, her thick glasses allowing her to monitor both her excavation and the subtle power struggle taking place nearby. Mrs. Vasquez, Cartwright interjected, I'm sure the university would be happy to coordinate with your historical research through proper administrative channels. Elena's smile was sharp as obsidian. Young man, I've been documenting this county's history since before you were born. I don't require administrative permission to record what's happening on public land. The confrontation escalated quickly. Thornfield attempted to assert academic authority over the site, while Elena calmly cited county ordinances and historical preservation statutes that gave her equal access. Sheriff Morrison arrived within minutes, too quickly to be coincidental, suggesting surveillance and rapid response protocols. Elena, Morrison said with carefully controlled familiarity, I wasn't aware you were planning research in this area. Wade, I wasn't aware I needed your permission to document county history, Elena replied, with the tone of someone who had known Morrison since childhood. Unless there's something about this site that requires special protection. Sarah watched the exchange with growing understanding. Elena wasn't just a local historian. She was positioned as a check on official corruption, someone with enough community standing and historical knowledge to challenge suppression of inconvenient evidence. Her arrival represented the emergence of local resistance to outside manipulation. Morrison's radio crackled with coded communications that brought additional personnel to the site. Within an hour, the excavation area was surrounded by law enforcement officials who maintained professional courtesy while establishing clear control over access and documentation. The message was unmistakable. Cooperation with official directives was no longer optional. Dr. Thornfield, Agent Collins announced, appearing with the same federal authority that had intimidated Sarah the previous night. We need to discuss some security concerns that have arisen regarding your research activities. The public nature of the confrontation was calculated to demonstrate federal oversight to both the university team and local observers. Sarah found herself at the center of attention as Collins approached her work area with obvious interest in her documentation methods. Miss Chen, I understand you've had concerns about proper protocols for archaeological documentation, Collins said, his tone suggesting official benevolence. We've arranged for additional resources to ensure your research meets the highest professional standards. The additional resources materialized as a federal observer, a young woman in civilian clothes who carried herself with the rigid posture of military training. She introduced herself as Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a government archaeologist assigned to provide technical support for university research activities. Sarah recognized the appointment as sophisticated surveillance. Walsh would monitor every aspect of her work while maintaining the fiction of academic collaboration. The arrangement provided official cover for suppression while eliminating any possibility of independent documentation. Elena Vasquez observed these developments with the calculating attention of someone who had witnessed decades of official manipulation. She moved through the site, taking photographs and making notes with the methodical thoroughness that matched Sarah's own approach. When their paths crossed near the limestone exposure, Elena spoke quietly without looking directly at her. "Sometimes the most important discoveries happen away from official attention," Elena murmured. "Old mining tunnels provide excellent storage for historical materials that require protection." The suggestion was delivered so casually that it could pass for general conversation about local geography. But Sarah understood the offer of assistance and secure storage for documentation that needed to survive official suppression. Elena was providing the local connections that could protect evidence from federal interference. The day's work proceeded under intense supervision that made normal excavation impossible. Every measurement was reviewed, every photograph required approval, and every field note was examined before recording. Sarah adapted by working more slowly and methodically, using the imposed oversight to disguise her continuing assessment of the site's actual significance. Dr. Walsh proved to be professionally competent, but ideologically compromised. Her archaeological training was evident in her technical comments, but her loyalty to federal directives overrode scientific objectivity. She praised Sarah's technique while redirecting her attention away from the most significant finds. "Your attention to detail is exceptional," Walsh commented during the afternoon heat. "But remember that our focus should remain on paleontological specimens rather than incidental materials that might confuse the research objectives." Sarah nodded compliance, while privately noting the locations of additional artifacts that Walsh was systematically ignoring. The Federal Observer was following a script that required acknowledging Sarah's skills while preventing their application to sensitive discoveries. As the day progressed, tensions escalated between Elena's historical documentation and federal efforts to control information flow. Elena's photographs included details that federal authorities preferred to suppress, while her interviews with local observers created records that existed outside official channels. The crisis point arrived when Elena approached Thornfield directly about coordinating their research efforts. Her proposal was reasonable and difficult to refuse without appearing obstructionist, but acceptance would undermine federal control over the site's documentation. "Dr. Thornfield," Elena said in a voice that carried across the excavation area, "I'd like to compare your geological findings with historical records of mining activity in this area. There might be interesting correlations between rock formations and documented burial sites." Thornfield's expression showed panic at the prospect of Elena's historical records being compared with their suppressed archaeological finds. The geological formations that supposedly contained only Cretaceous fossils would be revealed as recent burial sites that had been systematically excavated and resealed. "Miss Vasquez," Collins interrupted. "Federal archaeological resources are classified for security reasons. Civilian coordination requires clearance processes that could take several months." Elena's response was delivered with the dignity of someone who had spent decades fighting official stonewalling. "Agent Collins, county historical records are public documents. If federal activities are interfering with citizen access to public information, that raises constitutional concerns that require immediate resolution." The confrontation had escalated beyond local suppression to constitutional challenges that could attract media attention and congressional oversight. Sarah watched the federal agents consulting among themselves with obvious concern about the legal and political implications of Elena's resistance. Morrison attempted to defuse the situation by suggesting administrative compromises, but Elena refused to be deflected from her core demand: access to coordinate historical documentation with current archaeological findings. Her position was legally unassailable and practically devastating to the suppression effort. Sarah realized that Elena's intervention had created an opportunity for independent action. While federal attention focused on containing the local historian's challenge, surveillance of the university team had relaxed slightly. The window for decisive action was narrow, but real. As the afternoon sun angled toward the mountains, Sarah made her choice. During a brief moment when Walsh was distracted by the ongoing confrontation, she gathered her private documentation and field samples, securing them in her personal equipment bag rather than official storage containers. Elena's eyes met hers across the site, acknowledging the successful transfer with a slight nod. The local historian had provided both distraction and future storage for evidence that federal authorities were desperate to suppress. The day ended with unresolved tensions and escalating stakes. Elena departed with promises to return with additional historical documentation, while federal agents consulted with superiors about expanded security measures. Sarah prepared for evening documentation, knowing that tomorrow would bring even greater pressure and more dangerous choices. As the team packed equipment under federal supervision, Sarah caught Elena's final message delivered through casual conversation with Miguel. Mining tunnels stay cool even in summer heat. Good preservation conditions for delicate materials. The location and access method had been communicated. Tomorrow, Sarah would have to decide whether to risk everything by acting on the opportunity Elena had created, or continue the safer path of managed cooperation with federal authorities who grew more dangerous with each passing day. The abandoned copper mine lay hidden in a fold of desert hills 2 miles northwest of town, its entrance partially concealed by decades of rockfall and scrub vegetation. Sarah approached on foot in the pre-dawn darkness, her thick glasses reflecting starlight as she navigated the treacherous terrain with equipment that could document the truth. Federal authorities were desperate to suppress. Elena Vasquez waited inside the mine's entrance with battery-powered lights and a folding table that transformed the rocky chamber into an impromptu laboratory. Her presence confirmed the conspiracy of local resistance that had been forming around Sarah's discoveries, but it also meant crossing the final line between academic compliance and open defiance of federal authority. "I brought what you requested," Sarah whispered, producing her private documentation and the artifact samples she had managed to secure during the previous day's chaos. "But if we're discovered here, we won't be discovered if we work quickly and quietly," Elena interrupted, spreading Sarah's photographs across the table with the efficiency of someone who had conducted clandestine operations before. These images match historical records that federal agents don't want connected to their current activities. The correlation was devastating and undeniable. Elena's archival photographs showed the same limestone formations being used for burials over decades, with clear documentation of law enforcement involvement in body disposal operations. Sarah's recent finds represented the most recent layer of an ongoing criminal enterprise that reached into federal agencies. "How long has this been happening?" Sarah asked, comparing her geological measurements to Elena's historical timeline. "Since the 70s, when federal drug interdiction created the need for discrete disposal methods," Elena replied grimly. "Local cooperation was purchased through economic development projects and selective law enforcement. Your university dig was just the latest cover operation." Sarah felt the magnitude of what they were documenting settle around her like physical weight. Her academic research had stumbled into a criminal conspiracy that involved multiple levels of government and had operated with impunity for years. The evidence they were assembling could destroy careers and trigger federal investigations, but it could also result in their immediate elimination. Elena produced additional materials from deeper in the mine, boxes of documents and photographs that represented decades of careful documentation by local residents who had witnessed federal crimes but lacked the power to expose them. Sarah's scientific training provided the missing element that could make their evidence legally actionable. "There are others who have been waiting for someone with your credentials," Elena continued, opening files that showed the scope of local resistance. "People who lost family members to federal operations, Witnesses who were threatened into silence, officials who kept private records when they couldn't act publicly. The network of potential allies was larger than Sarah had imagined, but so was the danger of exposure. Federal surveillance of the dig site would eventually detect her absence, while her foreign student status made her vulnerable to immediate deportation if her activities were discovered. The window for action was closing rapidly. Sarah worked with desperate efficiency, photographing Elena's historical documentation while cross-referencing it with her own archaeological finds. The correlation established a clear pattern of federal involvement in systematic body disposal that could survive legal challenge if properly presented. Her myopia actually helped in the confined space of the mine, allowing her to examine documents and artifacts with exceptional detail despite the artificial lighting. "We need to establish secure communication with federal authorities who aren't compromised," Sarah said as she completed her documentation. "This evidence requires investigation by agencies that aren't involved in the cover-up." Elena's expression showed the skepticism of someone who had dealt with federal corruption for decades. "Child, there may not be any federal authorities who aren't compromised. This operation has been protected at levels that reach into Washington." The implication was sobering, but probably accurate. Sarah's academic training had prepared her to work within institutional frameworks, but those frameworks appeared to be corrupted beyond repair. Independent action was her only remaining option, but it required resources and connections that exceeded her capabilities as a foreign graduate student. "There is another possibility," Elena continued thoughtfully. "International pressure sometimes succeeds where domestic resistance fails. Your student visa connects you to institutions that federal agencies can't control directly." The suggestion offered a potential path forward. Sarah's university had international partnerships and exchange programs that operated independently of federal oversight. Academic colleagues in other countries might provide platforms for exposing federal crimes without triggering immediate suppression. As dawn approached, they completed their documentation and prepared to return the evidence to secure storage deeper in the mine network. Elena had established protocols for protecting materials that could survive federal raids while remaining accessible for future legal proceedings. The system had been refined through years of resistance to official corruption. "Sarah," Elena said as they prepared to separate, "you understand that after today, there's no returning to your previous life. Federal authorities won't allow you to simply resume academic work after documenting their crimes." Sarah adjusted her thick glasses and looked directly at the older woman. "I understood that when I decided to document the truth instead of accepting their arrangement. Some discoveries change everything, whether we want them to or not." The return journey to town required extreme caution, as federal surveillance would be heightened by her unexplained absence from the motel. Sarah approached from the east, using terrain features to avoid observation posts that had been established around Copper Ridge. Her academic training and fieldwork proved valuable for evading detection by authorities who underestimated her practical capabilities. Miguel waited in the motel parking lot with obvious concern for her safety and the success of her mission. His presence confirmed that local resistance included members of the university team, creating internal communication networks that federal authorities had failed to identify. The conspiracy of silence was breaking down from multiple directions simultaneously. "Dr. Walsh has been asking about your whereabouts," Miguel reported quietly. "Thornfield claims you're conducting private research that requires documentation review. They're planning some kind of formal intervention this morning." Sarah understood the implications. Federal authorities were moving to assert complete control over her activities before she could expose their criminal operations. The intervention would likely include confiscation of her documentation and immediate removal from the research program, followed by deportation proceedings that would eliminate her as a witness. "Miguel, I need you to contact university administration through channels that bypass Thornfield's authority," Sarah said urgently. "Tell them I'm requesting emergency academic protection for research that involves potential criminal activity." The request would trigger institutional protocols for protecting academic freedom, creating legal obstacles to federal suppression while establishing official records of her concerns. Universities had procedures for dealing with research that uncovered sensitive materials, though those procedures had never been tested against systematic federal corruption. As they prepared for the day's confrontation, Sarah felt the weight of transformation that Elena had predicted. Her identity as a compliant graduate student was ending, replaced by something more dangerous but more authentic, a witness whose testimony could expose crimes that federal authorities believed they had successfully suppressed. The dig site awaited with increased security and obvious preparation for decisive action. Federal agents had established perimeter control while Dr. Walsh prepared documentation that would justify Sarah's immediate removal from the research program. The morning's work would determine whether evidence of federal crimes would be suppressed or exposed to international scrutiny. Sarah secured her remaining private documentation and prepared for the final confrontation with authorities who had underestimated both her capabilities and her determination. Her myopia might limit her distant vision, but it had trained her to examine closely the details that others preferred to ignore. Today, that training would be tested against federal resources designed to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. The desert sun rose over another day of officially routine archaeological research, while underground networks prepared to challenge federal authority through carefully documented evidence of systematic criminal activity. Sarah's transformation from compliant student to dangerous witness was complete, but the ultimate outcome remained hidden in the dangerous territory between academic freedom and federal power. The confrontation came during the morning briefing, with federal agents positioned to document Sarah's removal from the research program while maintaining the fiction of academic due process. Thornfield stood with obvious discomfort as Agent Collins prepared to execute the intervention that would eliminate her as a witness to federal crimes. But Sarah had prepared her own surprise that would transform the dynamic of their carefully orchestrated suppression. "Miss Chen," Collins began with official formality, "your research activities have raised security concerns that require immediate administrative review. Dr. Walsh will escort you to federal facilities for debriefing about sensitive materials you may have encountered." Sarah remained seated at the folding table, her thick glasses reflecting the morning sun as she consulted a folder that made Collins visibly tense. "Agent Collins, before we proceed with any administrative actions, I should inform you that I've filed formal documentation with the International Association of Archaeological Sciences regarding potential violations of academic research protocols." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of consequence that federal authorities had failed to anticipate. International academic organizations operated beyond the reach of domestic suppression, while their investigative procedures could expose federal crimes to global scrutiny that would be impossible to contain. Collins' expression shifted from confident authority to calculated concern. "Miss Chen, international organizations have no jurisdiction over domestic research activities conducted under federal oversight. Actually, they do have jurisdiction over academic misconduct that involves foreign researchers," Sarah replied, producing documents that confirmed her formal complaint had been received and logged for investigation. Particularly when that misconduct involves suppression of evidence related to criminal activity. Elena Vasquez emerged from behind the canvas shelter, where she had been waiting with additional documentation that transformed the morning briefing into a formal confrontation between federal authority and international academic oversight. Her presence confirmed that Sarah's actions had coordinated support that exceeded federal capacity for immediate suppression. "Agent Collins," Elena said with the dignity of someone who had spent decades preparing for this moment, "I've also filed documentation with the United Nations Working Group on Enforced Disappearances regarding systematic disposal of human remains in this area. Their investigation protocols include protection for witnesses and evidence that domestic authorities have been unable or unwilling to preserve." The federal agents consulted among themselves with obvious alarm at the scope of international involvement that Sarah and Elena had triggered through their coordinated resistance. Domestic suppression operations were ineffective against global academic and human rights organizations that operated independently of federal control. Dr. Walsh attempted to maintain her cover as an academic observer, but her military bearing became obvious under pressure from international oversight that she had no training to manage. These international complaints are based on misinterpretation of normal archaeological findings, she said with decreasing confidence. Sarah opened her documentation folder and spread photographs across the table, where everyone could see the evidence that federal authorities had failed to suppress. Dr. Walsh, these photographs show systematic burial patterns that correlate with missing persons reports dating back decades. International investigators will determine whether they represent normal archaeological findings or evidence of criminal activity. The photographic evidence was devastating and undeniable. Elena's historical documentation provided context that established federal involvement, while Sarah's scientific analysis proved the recent origin of remains that contradicted geological dating. Together, they had assembled a case that could survive legal challenge from any domestic authority. Thornfield finally found his voice, though it carried the strain of someone whose career was collapsing around him. "Miss Chen, you've exceeded your authority as a graduate student and violated research protocols that govern this excavation." "Dr. Thornfield," Sarah replied with newfound confidence, "I've followed international standards for archaeological documentation that supersede local protocols when those protocols conflict with scientific ethics. My graduate program specifically requires adherence to global professional standards rather than regional variations that may compromise research integrity." The argument was legally sophisticated and professionally unassailable. Sarah's academic training had provided the knowledge needed to navigate international oversight systems that federal authorities couldn't manipulate through domestic pressure. Her foreign student status, initially a vulnerability, had become a source of protection through global academic networks. Miguel stepped forward with additional support that demonstrated the breadth of resistance that had developed around Sarah's discoveries. Dr. Thornfield, several graduate students have also filed complaints with the university administration regarding suppression of research findings and intimidation of team members. The Graduate Student Association has requested formal investigation of research misconduct. The coordination was perfect and devastating. While federal authorities had focused on suppressing Sarah's individual resistance, local networks had been organizing broader challenges to their operations through multiple channels simultaneously. The morning briefing had become a formal confrontation between federal authority and coordinated international oversight that exceeded their capacity for immediate suppression. Collins made a final attempt to assert federal control over the deteriorating situation. "All parties should understand that national security considerations override international academic protocols when classified materials are involved." Elena responded with documents that demolished his position completely. "Agent Collins, classified materials require formal designation through established legal procedures. These burial sites have never been officially classified, which means international investigators have full access rights under academic research protections." The federal position collapsed entirely as the scope of their legal exposure became clear. Decades of criminal activity had been conducted under informal suppression that couldn't survive formal international scrutiny. Sarah's documentation and Elena's historical records provided evidence that would trigger multiple investigations beyond federal control. Sheriff Morrison arrived with obvious reluctance to support federal authorities, whose operations were now exposed to global oversight. His local political survival required distancing himself from criminal activities that international investigators would certainly discover and prosecute. "Agent Collins," Morrison said carefully, "the county attorney has advised me that international investigations require full cooperation from local law enforcement. We'll need to preserve all evidence and provide access to any requested documentation. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Federal suppression had been replaced by international oversight that would investigate decades of criminal activity while protecting the witnesses who had exposed it. Sarah's academic training and Elena's local knowledge had combined to defeat sophisticated federal operations through superior legal positioning and coordinated resistance. As the morning progressed, additional support arrived from sources that federal authorities had failed to anticipate. University administrators appeared with legal counsel to protect academic freedom, while international observers established formal investigation protocols that would document federal crimes under global oversight. Sarah watched the transformation of her status from vulnerable foreign student to protected international witness, with satisfaction that was tempered by understanding of the long-term consequences. Her academic career would continue under international protection, but her life in the United States was ending as federal authorities prepared damage control operations that would reshape their relationship with academic institutions. Elena approached as the federal agents departed with obvious defeat in their posture and coordination. "You understand that this is just the beginning of a very long process," she said quietly. "International investigations move slowly, and federal authorities will attempt to limit their exposure through various legal maneuvers." Sarah adjusted her thick glasses and looked across the excavation site that had been transformed from an academic research project into a crime scene under international protection. "I understand, but the evidence will survive now regardless of federal attempts at suppression. Sometimes that's the best outcome available." The desert sun climbed toward noon as Sarah packed her legitimate documentation under international oversight rather than federal suppression. Her transformation from compliant graduate student to protected witness was complete, but her work was just beginning. The evidence she had preserved would fuel investigations that could continue for years, gradually exposing the full scope of federal criminal activity that had operated with impunity until her myopic attention to detail had revealed the truth. Miguel helped her secure the materials that would accompany her to international facilities, where her testimony would be recorded under global protection. "Your thick glasses saw what others missed," he said with respectful admiration. "Sometimes the eyes that see poorly at distance see most clearly what is close at hand." Sarah smiled at the repetition of his grandmother's wisdom, understanding now that her supposed disability had become her greatest professional asset. Academic training had taught her to examine evidence carefully, but personal necessity had taught her to look closely at what others preferred to ignore. The combination had made her dangerous to federal authorities who depended on academic compliance for their criminal operations. As the team prepared for transition to international oversight, Sarah made final entries in field notes that would become part of historical records documenting the exposure of systematic federal crimes. Her documentation had evolved from private insurance to official evidence that would reshape the relationship between academic institutions and federal authority. The desert wind carried the scent of distant mountains as Sarah concluded her work at the site where her academic career had been transformed into something larger and more consequential. International protection would allow her to complete her graduate studies while serving as a witness in investigations that could continue for decades, gradually exposing the full scope of federal criminal activity that had operated successfully until her careful attention to detail had revealed the truth that others had been paid to ignore.